Imagine waking up tomorrow and your student loan balance says zero. Not because you paid it off, not because of some payment plan, just gone. $1.73 trillion erased. Every borrower in America suddenly debt-free. Sounds like a dream, right? Here's the uncomfortable part. Someone still has to pay that bill. And the way that payment works might be the most revealing thing about how modern debt actually functions. Because student loans aren't like your credit card. They're not even like your mortgage. There's something stranger, something that connects the Federal Reserve to your tax return, to the value of every asset you'll ever own in ways most people never see coming. So what actually happens if we flip the switch? Not the political argument, not the fairness debate, just the raw mechanical reality of what occurs when you delete $1.73 trillion from the ledger. The answer is weirder and more destabilizing than either side wants to admit. Let's start with the number itself, because most people hear trillion and their brain just shuts off. $1.73 trillion in outstanding student debt. That's more than the entire economy of Canada. It's roughly the GDP of South Korea. If you stocked it in $100 bills, you'd reach the International Space Station 360 times. 43 million Americans hold this debt. The average balance is around $37,000, but averages lie. A third of borrowers owe less than $10,000. About 7% owe more than $200,000. Medical students, law students, people with graduate degrees they never finished. People who went to expensive private schools for degrees that didn't pan out. And yeah, people who made objectively bad decisions at 18 years old when someone handed you a pen and said, "Sign here for your future." Now, here's what makes this different from almost any other debt in the modern economy. 92% of it is owned by the federal government. Not banks, not private lenders, the United States Department of Education. That detail changes everything. Most people think of student loans like car loans. You borrow money, you pay it back, someone profits. That's not quite how this works. When the government issues a student loan, it's not lending you money it has sitting in a vault. It's creating a liability on your balance sheet and an asset on yours. You get the cash, the government gets a promise. That promise has a value. It's an asset the Treasury counts on. Every year, the Congressional Budget Office calculates how much of that debt will actually be repaid. They assume some people will default, some will go on income-driven plans and pay almost nothing for 20 years before forgiveness kicks in. Some will pay in full. Right now, they estimate the government will eventually collect about 90 cents on every dollar lent. That 10-cent gap, that's the real cost of the student loan program. That's the subsidy. Around $170 billion baked into the current system. But if you forgive everything instantly, that 10-cent loss becomes a 100-cent loss. You're not just erasing debt, you're converting a financial asset into a pure expenditure. $1.73 trillion shifts from the asset side of the government's balance sheet to the expense side. And that's when things get strange. The immediate shockwave. Let's say Congress passes a bill tomorrow, all federal student debt forgiven. What happens in the first 72 hours? 43 million people suddenly have extra cash flow. The average monthly payment is roughly $350. That's roughly $15 billion a month no longer going to loan servicers. Some of that money gets spent. People buy cars, they go on vacation, they increase their grocery budget. Consumer spending ticks up. Some of it gets saved. Borrowers who've been delaying down payments on houses suddenly have a path to home ownership. Demand for mortgages inches higher in competitive markets. Sounds good so far. But here's the other side. The federal government just took a $1.73 trillion loss. That doesn't disappear. It shows up as an increase in the deficit for that fiscal year. Now, if you're paying attention to how government accounting works, you know deficits don't always mean immediate consequences. The US borrows money at extremely low rates. It can roll over debt almost indefinitely. In theory, this is manageable. But markets don't run on theory. They run on perception. If foreign investors start to believe the US is becoming fiscally reckless, if they think the government will simply erase debts whenever politically convenient, they start to demand higher interest rates to compensate for risk. Even a small uptick in treasury yields ripples through the entire economy. Mortgage rates go up, corporate borrowing costs increase, credit card interest climbs. The irony here is sharp. You just freed 43 million people from debt, but you may have made debt more expensive for everyone else. Now let's talk about who actually benefits. Student debt isn't evenly distributed at all. The majority of student debt is held by people with bachelor's degrees or higher, people who statistically earn significantly more over their lifetimes than those without degrees. The median lifetime earnings for someone with a bachelor's degree is about $1 million more than someone with just a high school diploma. So when you forgive all student debt, you're handing the largest benefit to people who are already positioned to out-earn the rest of the population. Meanwhile, the plumber who never went to college, the single mom who skipped school to work full-time, the guy who paid off his loans by living with his parents for 6 years, they get nothing except the bill. Because that $1.73 trillion doesn't vanish, it gets absorbed into the federal budget, which means it's paid for through some combination of higher taxes, reduced spending, or increased borrowing that future taxpayers have to service. You've just executed one of the largest upward wealth transfers in American history, and you did it in the name of helping people. The optics are brutal. But let's say you don't care about fairness. Let's say you think the benefits outweigh the costs. There's still a deeper problem. What happens the day after forgiveness? A high school senior is choosing between colleges. She gets accepted to a state school for $15,000 a year and a private school for $60,000 a year. Before forgiveness, that decision mattered. The debt was real. It followed you. It shaped your choices. After forgiveness, the calculation changes. If the government just wiped $1.73 trillion in debt, what's stopping them from doing it again? Why not take the expensive school, max out your loans, and wait for the next wave of forgiveness? This is called moral hazard, and it's not a theoretical concern. It's a predictable human response. Colleges know this too. If borrowers expect future forgiveness, they're less sensitive to price. And if borrowers are less sensitive to price, colleges have no incentive to control costs. Tuition has already increased 8 times faster than wages over the past 30 years. Forgiveness doesn't fix that. It accelerates it. You're not solving the problem. You're pouring gasoline on it. Now we get to the part most people don't want to hear. $15 billion a month in freed up cash flow. That's $180 billion in additional spending power injected into the economy. If the economy is running below capacity, if there's slack in the labor market, if factories and businesses can ramp up production easily, that extra spending creates growth, more demand, more jobs, more prosperity. But if the economy is already running hot, if supply chains are tight, if unemployment is low, if production can't keep up, that extra spending just becomes inflation. You're not creating more goods, you're just bidding up the price of existing goods. Every dollar of debt forgiveness that turns into consumption is a dollar pushing up prices for everyone, including the people who never had student loans in the first place. And here's the kicker. Inflation is a regressive tax. It hurts the poor more than the rich because the poor spend a higher percentage of their income on necessities, food, rent, gas, the things that inflate fastest. So you forgave student loans to help the middle class, and in doing so, you made life harder for the working class. The math is cold, but it's real. Let's zoom out for a second. Student loans aren't the only debt people struggle with. Medical debt in America totals around $220 billion. It ruins lives. It drives people into bankruptcy. Why not forgive that too? Auto loans, $1.6 billion. Plenty of people stretched themselves too thin buying cars they couldn't afford. Should we wipe that out? Credit card debt, $1 trillion. Much of it accumulated by people in genuine financial distress. Mortgages, $10 trillion. Homeowners who bought at the peak of the market and are now underwater. Where's the line? If the logic is this debt is burdensome and forgiveness would help, then you've opened a door you can't close. And if the logic is student loans are special because education is a public good, okay, but so is healthcare, so is housing, so is transportation. You're not making a policy argument anymore. You're making a philosophical one about what the role of government debt is. And once you start forgiving one category, every other category will demand the same treatment. The political pressure becomes unstoppable. Here's something almost nobody talks about. The US dollar is the global reserve currency. That's not an accident. It's because the world trusts that the US manages its finances with some level of discipline. When the US government borrows money, it does so in dollars. And because everyone uses dollars for international trade, there's constant demand for US debt. This allows the US to borrow at lower rates than almost any other country. But that trust isn't infinite. If foreign investors start to believe the US is engaging in reckless fiscal policy, if they think the government will simply erase debts whenever politically convenient, they start to lose confidence. They don't dump treasury bonds overnight, but they slowly rotate into other assets, euros, yen, gold, Bitcoin, whatever offers stability. And if demand for US debt weakens, the government has to pay higher interest rates to attract buyers, which makes every dollar of debt more expensive to service, which creates a feedback loop. You forgave student debt to help Americans, but you may have undermined the financial architecture that makes American prosperity possible. It's a slow burn, but it's real. Let's be honest about what this really is. Student debt forgiveness isn't a policy, it's a political maneuver. It polls well with young voters, it energizes a base, it's a tangible deliverable that politicians can point to and say, I did this for you. But it doesn't fix the underlying system. It doesn't address why college costs so much. It doesn't reform how loans are issued. It doesn't change the incentives that created the problem in the first place. It's a one-time transfer, a sugar rush, and the second it's done, the conversation moves to the next crisis. Meanwhile, the people who didn't benefit feel cheated. The people who paid off their loans feel punished for being responsible. The people who never went to college feel ignored. You've created resentment, division, a sense that the system rewards the loudest voices rather than the smartest policies. And 5 years later, student debt is back, because nothing structural changed, and now you're having the same debate again. Except this time, everyone expects forgiveness because you set the precedent. Here's the truth that doesn't fit neatly into any political narrative. Student debt forgiveness is a band-aid on a gunshot wound. The real problem is that higher education in America has become unaffordable. Not because of greed, not because of some conspiracy, but because of a decades-long feedback loop between government subsidies, institutional spending, and cultural expectations. When the government guarantees student loans, it removes the risk for lenders, which means they lend more freely, which means students can borrow more, which means colleges can charge more, which means students have to borrow more, which means the government guarantees bigger loans. It's a closed loop, and forgiveness doesn't break it. If you want to solve this, you have to make colleges accountable for outcomes. You have to cap tuition at public institutions. You have to stop guaranteeing loans for programs with terrible job prospects. You have to let some schools fail. But that's politically toxic, because it means telling people no. It means limiting choice. It means accepting that not every degree is worth funding. So instead, we talk about forgiveness, because it feels like helping, even if it doesn't actually solve anything. Let's play this out one more step. Imagine student debt gets forgiven tomorrow. The immediate reaction is celebration, relief, gratitude. But 6 months later, reality sets in. Interest rates are up, inflation is ticking higher, the deficit has exploded, and Congress is now debating cuts to Social Security, Medicare, infrastructure spending because the budget is underwater. The very programs that benefit the working class and the elderly are on the chopping block to pay for a policy that primarily benefited the college-educated middle class. Was it worth it? And here's the darker question. What happens when the next cohort of students graduates with loans? Do they get forgiveness too? Or do you tell them, sorry, you missed the cutoff? If you forgive again, you've institutionalized bailouts. If you don't, you've created a permanent class of people who feel cheated. There's no clean exit. So what if all student debt was forgiven tomorrow? 43 million people would breathe easier. Payments would stop. Cash flow would increase. Some lives would genuinely improve. But the cost would ripple outward in ways most people never see. Higher interest rates, accelerated inflation, fiscal instability, moral hazard, resentment, precedent. And 5 years from now, we'd be right back here, with a new generation of borrowers and the same broken system. Because forgiveness doesn't fix the problem, it just moves it. The real question isn't whether we should forgive student debt, it's whether we're willing to fix the system that created it. And so far, the answer seems to be no.